All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to, I think it's the 10th week of school, including the break. I hope everybody had a good spring break. Decent. Maybe, you found some time to enjoy your lives, but also found a lot of time to get ahead, get situated for the final stretch to the end, which is on the horizon. We see it. It's coming. This will all end, but there's a lot of work to be done before then, so you guys should be fully invested in this whole process right now, and just like be all in and sacrifice a lot for it. It's going to be worth your time. It will end. You will have free time. You will be able to decompress from all the I don't want to say stress that you put yourself through, but I mean it is potentially stressful. But if you manage it correctly, it doesn't have to be stressful. It's just if you really optimize your time, because you have a lot of it still to get everything done, then you can get everything done. You're not going to have a lot of extra time for other stuff, but you'll feel good about what you've done, and then you will have time to enjoy your free time and sort of reflect positively on what you've accomplished. So make sure that you are doing that. Make sure that you are committed to this for the next, it's roughly 6 weeks. And again, that will end, and then you will have time to get over it. All right, so as far as this class goes, we have an exam next week. So we're going to finish up the material for the second part of the course today. We're going to finish up Chapter 8, then take a break, and then we're going to start Chapter 9. And then next week we will have our exam, and then after the exam we'll continue Chapter 9, and then the following week we'll have off because I can't show up that day. I have something I have to take care of. So that's sort of where we're at right now. Obviously you've had a break, so there's a slight break in the momentum of the course. But as I said, you should have been spending the time to catch up, to prepare yourself for the second exam, to knock out some of those mini papers, which ideally you did, and so maybe you're already at the point where you're done completely with the paper, which is where you should be. But if you're not, you should definitely get on that sooner rather than later. You're gonna start running out of opportunities very soon. I think there's like maybe 3 more chapters we cover, including, but this one, so Chapter 8 that we finished today will have a mini paper. Chapter 9, Chapter 10. I don't know if Chapter 11 will. I don't know if we finish it before the deadline of mini papers, so you may only have 3 left, plus the open chapter option. Anyway, I'm talking to people obviously that are generally not prone to get things done early, so they may actually be at the point where they haven't done anything. And I don't know if you're in this room with me or not, but I mean, it's likely that you're not. And so just keep in mind that like the time will run out, and if you don't get your mini papers in, you're going to lose a really good opportunity to just knock out some really easy points in the class. So just don't let that happen to you. Get it done, and that'll be that. Alrighty, are there any questions about anything you want me to talk about before I move forward with the material I'm going to cover today? All right, cool. Very good. So second part of the course, Chapter 5, we established just a general sort of model of production, which then got us to the costs that we need to consider when we're examining the optimal decisions by managers of firms in different market settings, which is what this chapter got us to. So that's what we did in Chapter 5. Chapter 6, we dealt with some practical issues of procuring inputs, getting the inputs that you need to produce, and ways to sort of optimize the relationship between managers and their workers. Slight topics there covered. Then Chapter 7, we talked about like the nature of industry. So we talked about the characteristics of what makes maybe one industry more competitive than another. And there were a lot of practical things covered there. Some measures of how competitive one marketplace may be versus another. Just kind of laying the groundwork for then now moving forward using the framework from Chapter 5 to start analyzing the best way that firms can operate and ultimately maximize their profits in the whole range of possible marketplaces they can operate in that run the gamut of competitiveness. So we started last week, 2 weeks ago, by covering the perfectly competitive model, which is the is the sort of the extreme end of the spectrum of how competitive a market can be. We talked about the characteristics of that marketplace, which I'll review today. And then we started talking about monopoly, so we'll continue talking about monopoly and finish monopoly today. And then we'll talk about monopolistic competition, which is sort of a hybrid of monopoly and perfect competition. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll move on to the next part of the course, in which we'll start talking about the most complex market setting, that is the oligopoly setting. Oligopolies are markets made up of several large firms that dominate the market. I say several because there are more than a couple, but generally it's not a lot. It's a small number that basically can control a market the way a monopolist does and want to, but they can't because there are laws that stop them from working together. But they still need to take into consideration what their rivals are doing in order to get the best outcome out of the market. So it's a marketplace that's characterized by interdependence of decision making, whereas in monopoly, monopolistic competition, and perfect competition, the firms make decisions based on just their own conditions in relation to the market, whereas in oligopoly, firms have to make decisions based on not just their own conditions, but on what their rivals are potentially doing. And so they have to take that into consideration, which complicates the analysis. And so you're going to get, a lot of sort of different models that can explain different types of possible situations that oligopolists might find themselves in. And that's what Chapter 9 covers. It covers some of those models. And then we have a different approach we use to study oligopoly, which is called game theory, and that is covered in Chapter 10. So oligopoly is the most complicated setting and therefore requires the most sort of analysis. And then beyond that, Chapter 10. Chapter 11, we deal with different strategies that firms that have market power, which is the ability to set their prices above their marginal cost, different strategies that they can employ in order to maximize their revenues. And then Chapter 12 deals with information issues related to like the absence of information by either side of the market, either the consumers or the producers, and some of the issues related to that. So we're heading to the end, and it all is sort of lining up to kind of all lead from one thing to the next. So it's all connected, it all kind of builds on itself. So there is some connectivity there, but also, as you've seen, there's different sort of nuances to each of the models that we cover. And so even though there's a connection there, there's also things that differentiate them. And if you're not really in tune with what's being presented here via my lectures and maybe you're reading as well, then it's easy for you to kind of mix things up and like kind of let them overlap in your mind. That's why you have to take enough time to make sure that you understand how to understand maybe like the model of perfect competition versus monopoly versus monopolistic competition, and how those are different from oligopoly, and sort of what are the factors that lead to one outcome in a market versus another outcome in a market. So stay on top of the materials, ultimately what I'm trying to say here. All right, so Chapter 9, we'll start just talking about basic stuff about oligopoly, and then we'll get into the first models that we'll cover. There's 4 different ones that will be covered in this chapter. We'll cover the first and half of the second, and then we'll call it a night. And as far as the Chapter 8 mini paper goes, I'll set that up to be due like the following week, the week after your exam, and so then you'll have some time to work on that if you choose to work on that chapter's paper. All right, so previously we started again looking at perfect competition, and then we jumped into monopoly. In perfect competition, there's many buyers and sellers in the market, each of which is small relative to the market, so nobody can dominate the market. each firm in the market produces an identical product. It's exactly the same as their competitors, so they can't make a different version of what's being sold. Generally these things are called commodities, which are like the most generic sort of inputs into production, such as like wheat or steel or oil, things that you just really can't take and make your own version of. It's all the same thing. All the buyers and sellers in a perfectly competitive market have perfect information. Everybody knows everything they need to know. All buyers know that there's a bunch of sellers and everybody's selling the same thing and everybody's selling it at the same price. And all the sellers know that all their rivals have pretty much the same cost conditions, very similar cost conditions. So nobody's able to do anything more than what the market allows them to do. There's no transaction costs, so there aren't any of those complications that we talked about in chapter 6. It's all very smooth. The thing that needs to be bought can easily be purchased. There's one price. It's clear. It's clear where you can buy it. There isn't going to be things such as like the hold-up problem that we talked about in chapter 6, where there needs to be a specialized investment in the transaction that might that could ultimately be used to as leverage against a buyer. Nothing of that sort. There's free entry and exit into the market. Firms can easily enter and exit the market if there are profits to be made, and they do. And profits are the thing that either lure them in or have them leave the market. So the demand and supply framework that we've been studying in this course is a model of a perfectly competitive market. And now we're just taking the perspective of the firm of that market. And so from the perspective of the firm, the equilibrium price set in the market establishes the perfectly elastic flat demand curve for the firm. So their demand equals the equilibrium price. The firm is trying to maximize their profits. It happens at the point where their revenues, which are just a linear function of the quantity of output they produce, because everybody is a price taker. Nobody can affect the price. There's one price being set in the market. And so therefore the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained from selling additional units, is equal to the price. It's just a constant amount. It's not changing. And so if we look at their revenue that has the slope, which is marginal revenue, which is constant, you're going to get just a straight line. And then we're going to have our cost curve that reflects the conditions we talked about in chapter 5. And the furthest distance between these two curves represents the highest amount of profits the firm can make. And the point at which that happens represents the profit maximizing level of output. And it happens that at that point, the slopes of these two curves are equivalent. So the marginal revenue, the slope of the revenue curve, is equal to the marginal cost, the slope of the cost curve. So that's one way to look at how perfectly competitive firms can maximize their profits. The better way is to look at the marginal costs and the average total cost curve and see if there are any profits being made at the profit maximizing level. So the firm in a perfectly competitive market faces that elastic demand curve, which is equal to the equilibrium price, and price is equal to their marginal revenue. So this is also their marginal revenue curve. And they have a marginal cost curve that's kind of swoosh shaped. And again, it reflects that shape because there are initially increasing returns to labor, meaning that firms benefit from specialization. They hire a few extra people at the beginning and they divide up tasks, and they are able to produce more than the last person hired because they're dividing up tasks and getting better at what they do. But because they're in the short run and they're limited by the amount of capital they have, then eventually that starts to become a limitation and they face decreasing returns to their labor input, at which case their marginal cost starts to increase. And that's why we get that marginal cost curve that looks like this. The perfectly competitive firm maximizes their profits by setting their marginal cost equal to the marginal revenue. So at the point where these two curves intersect is the profit maximizing level of output. And then the firm can figure out, how are they performing at that level? Well, at that level, they have to look at their average total cost, their average cost of producing at that level. If it's below the price they're charging, they're going to make a profit on that unit, and of course, they're going to make a profit on every unit they sell at that level. So the difference between the price and the average total cost of producing at the optimal level times the optimal amount will give you the profits for the firm. Now, it's totally possible for there to be a situation where at the point where their marginal revenue equals the marginal cost curve, setting their optimal level, at that level that the average total cost of producing is above the price because the average total cost curve is above the price. In that case, the firm will be taking on losses. Now, the question then arises, should the firm continue operating? If the average variable cost curve is below the price at that level, then at the very least, the revenues that are being collected are covering their variable costs, are covering their cost of their wages because their variable input is labor. And in this case, they even have some revenue left over to cover some of their fixed costs. The fixed cost is the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost. That gives you your average fixed cost times the quantity gives you the total fixed cost. So this is the amount the firm would have to pay if it's shut down. And given that they're operating, they're able to have some workers work and cover some of their fixed costs. And so even though they're at a loss, they're making a loss, the firm should continue operating under this circumstance. This is a different situation where the average variable cost curve is also above the price at the optimal point of production for this firm, where, again, their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. At that point, average total cost is, of course, above the price, which means that there are economic losses, and the average variable cost is also above the price, which means that the revenues collected, the price times the quantity, aren't even covering the variable cost. And so in that situation, the firm should shut down, because if they shut down, the only losses they'll incur are the fixed costs, which again are the difference between average total cost and average variable cost times quantity, which is less than the loss that they would face by continuing operating, because to continue operating means that they'd have to pay some of the wages out of pocket beyond the revenues that they're collecting. So if the average total variable cost is above the price, then they should shut down. And so then we sum that up as their short-run output decision for perfect competition. To maximize short-run profits, a perfectly competitive firm should produce in the range of increasing marginal cost, where price equals marginal cost, provided that the price is greater than or equal to the average variable cost. If the price is less than the average variable cost, the firm should shut down its plant to minimize its losses. And then that got us to the supply curve for the individual firm in a perfectly competitive market, which winds up being their marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost curve. So again, if the price, which is moving because over here there's a supply and a demand, and those are being affected by other forces in the market, if the price is moving up along the marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost curve, then that'll dictate how much the firm is willing to supply, and therefore this is their supply curve. But if the price falls below the minimum of the average variable cost curve, then they'll be incurring economic losses beyond their fixed costs, which means they should shut down. And so therefore this is the firm's short-run supply curve. The perfectly competitive firm's short-run supply curve is their marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost. And then we saw that we can go from an individual firm's marginal cost curve, which is their individual firm supply curve, to the market supply curve by doing a horizontal summation, meaning we look at a price and we see how much quantity is supplied at that price by an individual firm across all firms. If all the firms are identical, you just multiply that quantity by the amount of firms, in this case 500. So at $12, each firm will supply one. There's 500 firms, so for the market supply at $12, it was 500 units. So that's how you get from the individual firm supply to the market supply. As far as long-run decisions for perfectly competitive firms, well, if the firm is making economic profits, meaning that the average total cost curve is below the price where the firm is optimally supplying, where marginal cost equals price, then that's going to lead other suppliers to enter the market because they know that there's profits being made. Once that happens, supply shifts to the right, which lowers the equilibrium price, and so it'll lower the equilibrium price to the point where it is touching the average total cost curve at its minimum, in which there are zero economic profits being made. So profits in the long run will cause firms to enter because there are no barriers to entry, and that will cause the price to fall, and economic profits will go down to zero. If there are firms making losses in the short run, in the long run, those firms will exit the market. If those firms exit the market, then the supply curve will shift to the left, which will increase the equilibrium price in the market, and therefore it will bring the price up to the point where it is just tangent to the average total cost curve of those firms that can still operate in the market. And therefore, those firms will make zero economic profits in the long run. And so therefore, the long run competitive equilibrium is the point at which the price equals marginal cost, and price also equals the minimum of the average total cost curve. It is the point at which there are zero economic profits. And again, zero economic profits means that at the very least, they're covering their implicit costs, meaning that the return that they could be getting from investing the money they have in their firm in the marketplace is at least being covered. But yeah, so this is the case for a perfectly competitive firm in the long run due to the fact that there are no barriers to entry. So this is where like these markets are always heading. They're always heading to the point where there are no economic profits to be made. But the long run is sort of like this abstract theoretical place that things are always heading. There will always be profits, but those profits will always be eroded. All right, then we jumped into the other end of the competitive spectrum, monopoly, in which there's only one firm dominating the market. So monopoly refers to a situation where a single firm serves an entire market for a good for which there's no close substitute. So in a perfectly competitive market, everybody was selling a perfect substitute for what everybody else was selling. Everybody's selling the exact same thing. In a monopoly, whatever's being sold has no substitutes. Nobody's selling the same thing. Only one seller is selling it. And so that means that monopolies have monopoly power. They have the ability to charge above their marginal cost. Because there's only one firm operating in the market and they basically define the market, they face the downward sloping demand curve in the market, which is, again, in contrast to the perfectly competitive firm that faces the perfectly elastic flat demand curve at the price being set in the perfectly competitive market, in which is a bunch of sellers, a bunch of buyers. Here, there aren't a bunch of sellers, a bunch of buyers. There's only one seller, and so the demand is theirs. And so the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. We talked about the sources of monopoly power. So what are the things that can lead to there being one firm dominating the market? One of the things that can lead to that is economies of scale. Economies of scale means that there's decreasing average total costs in the long run. And the reason for that is because generally, one of the reasons is that firms maybe have invested a lot of fixed costs into the operation. So if you think about like utilities that need to set up huge amounts of distribution networks for whatever it is they're supplying, that costs a lot of money. And so that means that their average cost of producing is going to be heavily impacted by the spreading effect of that average fixed cost always going down as they produce more and more. Because again, fixed costs are costs that don't change. Average fixed costs are always going to be decreasing as long as capital is not being changed, because you're dividing a number that's not changing by a number that is changing and getting bigger, which is the amount that's being supplied in the market. So as the firm gets bigger and bigger, and they've invested a lot of money into setting up shop, then the spreading effect of that average total cost is going to be dominating over the range that they might be supplying at, and therefore they will benefit from being as big as possible, which means that other firms would need to be that big to compete, and generally they're not going to be able to do that. So just one quick example is this one here, where maybe they face this average total cost curve and they have this demand curve here, and the monopoly amount that's being supplied is this amount here, and that that corresponds to a price that would be above the average total cost, so therefore there would be some profits. But let's say another firm were to enter the market, they would have to divide up the output. And so they would each supply QM divided by 2, which would be here, which means that they would have to charge a price below their average total cost, which means that that they would be operating at a loss. So in some situations, when there are increasing returns to scale, it doesn't make sense for another firm to enter the market, given the demand conditions, and therefore there would only be one firm in those markets. A couple other reasons for monopoly power: economies of scope. We talked about economies of scope at the end of chapter 5. Economies of scope basically means that it's cheaper to produce things together than apart. And so therefore, when firms choose to produce things together, then they wind up having lower average cost of producing, which means that other firms would also need to do the same thing to be able to benefit from that kind of cost advantage. And that's generally going to be very difficult for most firms. If it's a big enough sort of enterprise and the things that are being produced together are producing enough savings for the firm in terms of costs, then it might even be impossible for other firms to enter the market, which means that they will be only a monopolist. The same thing can happen in the situation where there's cost complementarities. We talked about cost complementarities as well at the end of chapter 5. It basically exists in a multi-product cost function when the marginal cost of producing one output is reduced when the output of another product is increased. So the cost of producing additional units goes down when you produce things together. We talked about the example of donuts and donut holes. That's the easiest one. Anyway, under this situation, similar to the last one we talked about, the economies of scope, again, the firms benefit from producing things together, and that could be enough of a benefit where it'll stop other firms from entering the market because they would need to do the same thing. And then finally, patents and other legal barriers. Obviously, if you have the legal right to do something and nobody else has the legal right to do it, you're going to dominate. So that's the case with a lot of monopolists that are sometimes sort of prevalent in like pharmaceutical markets, where firms spend a lot of research and development to develop drugs that are unique. Also, in areas where any kind of intellectual property that can be copyrighted can become sort of like the product that's being sold, where nobody else can produce that same thing. But the thing about this kind of legal barrier and patent is that eventually this right to sell things exclusively does get eroded, either because competitors are able to reverse engineer the products, or because there is an expiration on the right to be the sole producer of something. Because even though we want there to be an incentive for people to create new products, there's also the adverse effects that having monopoly power has on markets, which is a trade-off that we as a society have considered and have decided, well, we don't want to prolong that indefinitely. We want to cut that off at one point so that eventually everybody does have a right to produce these things, and then prices go down and everybody has access to it. Which is why in a lot of things, like you see aspirin, like there's 1,000 different generic brands. Like ultimately, with a lot of drugs, you will see a bunch of generic brands that are introduced once the patents expire for the goods that are produced. All right, so now we're going to talk about the maximizing profits for monopolists. So remember, for the perfectly competitive firm, they maximize profits to the point where the price equaled marginal cost, because marginal revenue equal price for a perfectly competitive firm. That is not the case for a monopolist. For a monopolist, the marginal revenue is not equal to price, it's less than price. And the reason for that is because a monopolist faces the downward sloping demand curve. The demand is theirs. And so if they want to increase the amount they're going to sell, they have to move along their demand curve. If they move along their demand curve, that means they have to either raise or lower the price. So let's say they're supplying 100 units at $60 and they want to supply 150 units. So they do, and they get 50 more units of sales times the $50. So they get some additional revenue, but they do lose some revenue from the existing sales they would have had at the higher price that they have to lower the price on. So for the 100 units that were being sold at 60, they now have to lower the price by $10 for those, so they lose some revenue from that. So therefore, the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained from selling additional units, is going to be less than the price that they charge because, again, they're going to have some of the revenues taken away because of the fact they have to lower their prices on existing units they're selling. So this is called the price effect of a price change. This is the quantity effect of a price change. I'm sorry, no, this is the quantity effect. This is the price effect. And in this case, the quantity effect outweighs the price effect, which means that as the firm is moving from left to right here, their revenues are actually increasing. But that does change eventually. So they could get over this range here where they are increasing their price. I'm sorry, they're increasing the amount they're selling. The extra revenue they gain from selling additional units is far less than the revenue they lose on the existing units by lowering price, and that actually causes marginal revenue to be negative. And the point at which marginal revenue is zero is the point at which the revenues are at their maximum. And so here's a marginal revenue curve. It's zero right there. That's where it's maximum. And it actually also corresponds to the point where elasticity is equal to 1, something we talked about in Chapter 3. Beyond that point, demand becomes inelastic. And that's the point where the quantity effect is outweighed by the price effect, and increasing quantities will lower revenues. And so the firm obviously doesn't want to operate there. So they're only going to operate at the over the range where marginal revenue is less than price, but it's positive. All right. Now we talked about the fact that the marginal revenue curve has half the horizontal intercept that the demand curve has, and that means that it's twice as steep as the demand curve. So its slope in absolute value is twice the slope of the demand curve, which then allows us to really easily derive the marginal revenue equation when we get a demand function. So if we have our inverse demand function here where price is a function of quantity, and we want to get our marginal revenue equation, then we just double the slope. So we just put a 2 in front of there, and then that's how we're able to get our marginal revenue equation, which is a shortcut. Normally what you could do is multiply your inverse demand function, price times quantity, to get your revenue. That gets you your revenue function. And then you take the derivative of that to get to your marginal revenue function. But you don't have to do that if you know this trick, and just double the slope to get your marginal revenue. So we did a quick demonstration problem before we separated last time, where here was the inverse demand function for the monopolist. We were trying to figure out the maximum price per unit a monopolist can charge to sell 3 units, and we were asked what the marginal revenue was at 3 units, and so we put the price in, we put the quantity in there, we got the price there, and to find the marginal revenue, I think I missed a part here. The whole it was a simple problem. The whole point was to get from your demand function to your marginal revenue function. So it's about doubling the slope. The rest of the math was easy, and I already covered it. Anyway, let us move on finally to today's lecture. All right, so now that we understand that the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve and marginal revenue is below the demand curve, now the question is, like, how much will a monopolist supply in a market, and then what price will they charge, and how can we calculate profits? So profits are determined by both revenue and cost. Since the revenue a monopolist receives from selling Q units of output is equal to Q times P, quantity times price, the profits of a monopolist with a cost function of CQ are given by the difference between the revenue and the cost. Typical revenue and cost functions are graphed in the figure. So here's just a typical cost function. There's our revenue function up to its maximum before marginal revenue becomes negative, which is the other side of that, which we don't need to look at because monopolists won't care about that end of the revenue spectrum. They just care about this end, which is the only part that is above their cost function. And so obviously this is the only range of output that's going to give them positive profits. The vertical distance between the revenue and the cost functions, again, reflects the profits the monopolist can earn at alternative levels of output. Obviously, beyond point B, cost is greater than revenue, and before point A, the same thing, so obviously they would not want to supply there. Profits are their greatest, again, where these two curves are furthest away from each other. So where the vertical distance between the revenue and the cost function is the greatest. And once again, it happens to be that at that point, the slope of our revenue function and the slope of our cost functions are exactly equal, meaning that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So at the profit maximizing level of output, the slope of the revenue function equals the slope of the cost function. But in this case, marginal revenue is less than price. So that's the big difference here between a monopolist and a perfectly competitive firm. A perfectly competitive firm sets their marginal cost equal to their price, which is equal to their marginal revenue. They're essentially doing the same thing, setting the marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, but the difference for a perfectly competitive firm is their marginal revenue equals their price. So that's how they set their profit maximizing output. They set marginal cost equal to price. Since marginal revenue is less than price for a monopolist, they set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. So here again, we have the downward sloping demand curve that the monopolist faces, and here is its corresponding marginal revenue curve with twice the slope in absolute value of the demand curve. Let's throw in our standard marginal cost curve in there. So throwing that in there, that's going to tell us the optimal point of supply for the monopolist, the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So that's going to be this point here, QM. QM units are produced. That's the profit maximizing level of output for the monopolist. So that's how they set their level of output, but then they need to take an extra step beyond what a perfect competitor does to set their price, because perfect competitors are price takers. They don't set prices, they accept prices. But a monopolist, again, dominates the market, defines the market, and therefore once they figure out how much they want to supply, they have to figure out how much they're going to charge. In order to figure out how much they're going to charge, they have to then figure out, well, at the amount that I'm willing to supply, how much are people willing to pay for that amount? So they have to go up to the demand curve to figure out that price. So they do. So in this case, it's PM. So it's the price above the optimizing quantity, the profit maximizing quantity for the monopolist, QM. The maximum price per unit that consumers are willing to pay for QM units is PM. So the profit maximizing price is PM. So again, they are beholden to consumers, what consumers are willing to pay in their markets. Even though they can supply any quantity they want, they can't charge any price they want. They can only charge the prices that people are willing to pay. That means they have to be very in tune with what the demand conditions in their market are, versus a perfectly competitive firm who, again, only has to just accept the market price, and they can supply any amount at that same price, and marginal revenue doesn't change for them. For a monopolist, marginal revenue decreases as they increase the amount of output. And again, the point at which they want to supply is the point at which their marginal cost curve, which again reflects their internal production conditions. Remember chapter 5, we established production, and then that got us to cost. So this curve reflects a very specific type of production process for a firm, in this case, a monopolist. So at the point where their own cost conditions meet the conditions of the market is the point that they're going to maximize their profits, and then they're going to figure out what to charge at that level by going up to the demand curve to figure out the price. Monopoly profits are given by the shaded rectangle in the figure, which is the base QM times the height, the difference between the price that they can charge and their average total cost at the profit maximizing level of output. So here's their U-shaped average total cost curve. Again, the bottom of that average total cost curve happens where marginal cost crosses it. And so the difference between the price and the average total cost at their optimal level is the profit for that one unit times the amount they're selling, makes the entire profits that the monopolist can earn. So as far as calculating profits is very similar to the perfectly competitive firm, but the big difference here is that because there are barriers to entry for a monopolist, meaning that there's something stopping other firms from competing against them, then profits will not lure other firms into the industry. Like, they will be able to persist with those profits into the long run. All right, so that gets us to the monopoly pricing rule. Given the level of output QM that maximizes profits, the monopoly price is the price on the demand curve corresponding to QM units produced. All right, let's do a quick demonstration problem to solidify the logic of this model, which explains how monopolists should maximize their behavior. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolist product is given by P of Q equals 100 minus 2Q, and the cost function is given by 10 plus 2Q. Determine the profit maximizing price and quantity and the maximum profits. All right, so what is the condition that the monopolist needs to use to set their optimal level of output? They need to set what equal to what? Set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. What is the marginal cost here? It's 2, right? It's a derivative of our cost function. Cost function, again, is made up of 2 terms here. One that does not have a variable in it, which is considered the what? It's a fixed cost. So what is this? That's our variable cost. Taking the derivative of this with respect to quantity gets us 2, right? So that's our marginal cost. What is our marginal revenue equation? Say that out loud. Not 10. Oh, you're looking at your cost. 100 minus 4Q is correct. Remember, twice the slope on the inverse demand function. All right, so we're going to set our marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. We have a marginal revenue, which is equal to 100 minus 4Q. We have a marginal cost, which is equal to 2. So we just set them equal to each other and solve for Q. So 100 minus 4Q equals 2. Subtract 100 from both sides. Divide both sides by negative 4. The profit maximizing level for this monopolist is equal to 24.5. All right, so we're going to determine now the profits. Oh no. So now we have our quantity. Now we need to figure out the price that the firm is going to charge. So how do they figure out their price? What do they do to figure out their price? Plug what back into what? So plug in our optimal quantity into our inverse demand function. Very good. So the profit maximizing price is found by plugging in Q star into our inverse demand function. So just doing that, you get 100 minus, I think 49, which is equal to $51. So $51 is their profit maximizing price. So that's the extra step. With the monopolists, they actually need to figure out a price because they're not just taking the price as given like a perfectly competitive firm does. Now to calculate the maximum profits, we're going to look at revenue minus costs at the optimal level with the optimal price. So we have our optimal price, $51, optimal level, 24.5, minus the cost of producing 24.5 units. So we plug in 24.5 into our cost function and then subtract that from the revenue. In this case, profits wind up being 1,190.5. Any questions on how this was done? All right. Now, it's important to note that there is no actual supply curve for a monopolist. A supply curve determines how much will be produced at a given price. A monopolist determines how much to produce based on marginal revenue, which is less than price. So they have a rule that they follow with respect to marginal revenue that tells them how much output they're going to supply, and therefore there is no direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. So there is no supply curve for a monopolist. There's no way to express how a monopolist quantity choice would change for different given prices, so there's no supply curve for the monopolist. So that's again why the market model with the demand and supply curve is a market model for a perfectly competitive market in which there is a supply curve, which again is made up by aggregating the marginal costs of the individual firms above the minimum of their average variable costs. But a monopolist doesn't have something like that. A monopolist has a rule they follow to supply. And so, therefore, there is no clear relationship between price and quantity. And this is also a characteristic of all markets served by firms with market power, such as monopolistic competition, which we'll consider right now in a bit. All right, quick application here. Multi-plant decisions. We've assumed that a monopolist produces output at a single location. In many instances, a monopolist has different plants at different locations producing the same stuff, but it's likely they'll have different cost conditions at different plants. They could have a plant in the US and a plant in South America, where South America you're going to get a lot cheaper wages. And so, you know, there's going to be different costs associated with producing at different plants. An important issue for the manager of such a multi-plant monopoly is to determine the amount to produce at each plant. Suppose a monopolist produces output at 2 plants. The cost of producing Q1, which is output in plant 1, is some cost function. That's a function of that output level. And then the cost of producing Q2 is, again, some other cost function. So the subscripts, again, denote the fact that we're talking about different costs. Also, suppose the products produced at the 2 plants are identical, so that the price per unit consumers are willing to pay for the total output produced at the 2 plants is PQ, where the quantity that is sold in the market is equal to the sum of the outputs produced at the 2 different plants. So even though the stuff is being produced at different places, it's being sold in the same market. Profit maximization implies that the 2-plant monopolist should produce output in each plant such that the marginal cost of producing in each plant equal the marginal revenue of total output. So that's our multi-plant output rule. If we let marginal revenue equal MR of Q, of producing a total amount of Q, which again is made up of the 2 separate outputs from the 2 separate plants. And we suppose that the marginal cost of producing, again, Q1 is MC1 and Q2 is MC2. The profit maximization rule for the 2-plant monopolist is to allocate output among the 2 plants such that the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost in the first plant and the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost in the second plant, which essentially means that we're setting the marginal costs equal to each other. The economic intuition underlying the multi-plant output rule is precisely the same as all the profit maximizing principles. The conditions for maximizing profits in a multi-plant setting imply that, again, the marginal costs will be equal to each other. If for some reason at one plant the marginal cost is below the marginal revenue, then they're going to want to produce more at that plant than they produce at the second plant, up until the point where the marginal cost comes up to meet the marginal revenue. So obviously the point is to produce as much as you can, where you get as much of a cost savings benefit as possible. Quick demonstration problem. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolist product is given by P of Q equals 70 minus 0.5 Q. The monopolist can produce output in 2 plants. The marginal cost of producing in plant 1 is equal to 3Q1, and the marginal cost of producing in plant 2 is equal to Q2. How much output should be produced in each plant to maximize profits, and what price should be charged for the product? All right, so if you remember what we just covered, we're going to set our marginal cost equal to the marginal revenue, the marginal cost of each firm. That's going to give us a couple of relationships that will allow us to relate the quantities to each other. We have two different quantities we're solving for. When you have two quantities, you need two equations. So we have another equation, which we'll look at in a second. So to maximize profits, the firm should produce output in the two plants such that, again, the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost in each plant. What is marginal revenue? What is the equation here? 70 minus Q, right? So that's our marginal revenue. We're going to set that equal to marginal cost. What I did here first is I separated our quantity into our two quantity variables there, just to specify the fact that the overall amount that's being sold in the market is being produced in two different plants. Again, we're trying to solve for how much each plant will produce. So we're going to set that marginal revenue equal to marginal cost of plant 1. And then we're going to set the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost of plant 2. So the marginal cost of plant 1 was 3Q1. Marginal cost of plant 2 was Q2. So there's two equations there. I'm going to use this equation here to solve for one of my variables. So in this case, I'm going to, let me see, I have 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 equals 3Q1. So I subtracted 70 from both sides, and I added Q1 to both sides. So I have 4Q1 on the right minus 70 equals negative Q2. Divide both sides by negative 1. Gets me to this relationship between the second plant's output and the first plant's output, which is what you do when you're solving for two variables. You need to solve for one variable in terms of the other, right? And then you plug it into the other equation. So I'm going to plug equation 3 into equation 2. So I plugged in 70 minus 4Q1 for Q2 in this equation here. So we have 70 minus 70, so that's going to drop out there. And then we have Q1 minus 4Q1, that's going to be negative 3Q1. So the 70s drop out there. And then, so I plugged in for Q2, 70 minus 4Q1 there. All right, so we've got 3Q1 equals 70 minus 4Q1 there, and 7Q1 equals 70, which means Q1 star equals 10. Plugging this value into equation 3 will get us back to the other amount we need for the second plant, which is 30. So that means that for this firm to maximize their overall profits, they need to produce 10 units in firm 1 and then 30 units in firm 2 in their different plants. Actually, so I redid this yesterday because I was trying to make it better for you, but I think I did screw something up. I screwed something up down here, which is what I was trying to figure out a second ago. This should actually be plus 3Q1 here, which will lead me to Q1 star being 10. Anyway, I'll fix this before I post it for you. Anyway, so the method is the same. It's just a slight problem with the math. Nonetheless, I give myself partial credit. So there are my answers. Now I need to figure out what price the firm should charge for the product. And so therefore we need to plug in both quantities into our inverse demand function, 30 plus 10, 40. And that'll give us the price, which in this case is equal to $50. All right, anyway, so that's one application, just another way of basically getting to the same result, but adding the slight complication that the firm produces in two different plants. All right. Implications of entry barriers. As I mentioned earlier, because there are barriers to entry and other firms cannot enter the market, economic profits will persist. So if a monopolist is earning positive economic profits, the presence of barrier to entry prevents other firms from entering the market to reap a portion of those profits. Thus, monopoly profits, if they exist, will continue over time so long as the firm maintains its monopoly power. This doesn't mean that they will have positive economic profits, though. It all corresponds to the position of their average total cost curve relative to the price that they're charging. So again, it depends on where the demand curve lies in relation to the average total cost curve. So here, again, marginal cost equals marginal revenue, setting their optimal quantity. The price that they're going to charge is the price that people are willing to charge, are willing to pay for that amount. And that, in this case, happens to be the point where average total cost is just tangent to the demand curve. And so therefore the price equals average total cost. So there's no difference between price and average total cost. So there's no economic profit there. So this is one result that you could get in a monopoly. A monopoly could be in a situation in which they're making zero economic profit as well. But if they are making economic profits, they will continue making those into the long run, which is different than a perfectly competitive firm. And they could also be making economic losses if the average total cost is below the price. Is above the price at the profit maximizing quantity. In that case, the firm would want to shut down, depending on, again, if they're in the short run, where their average variable cost curve is. The monopoly power a monopolist enjoys often implies some social cost to society. So, again, marginal revenue is less than price. They set their marginal cost equal to marginal revenue to determine their monopoly output, and that tells us the price that they're going to charge, and the price is going to be above their marginal cost. To show how this affects the market adversely, we have a simple marginal cost curve that's just linear, increasing there. The first thing to notice about monopoly is that price exceeds the marginal cost of production, as we already said. The price in a market reflects what society, how society values another unit of output. The marginal cost reflects the cost to society of the resources needed to produce an additional unit of output. So for a monopolist, the value to society exceeds the amount that society has to pay in terms of cost, in order to produce the thing, which means that you could produce more things, you could produce more output. But obviously the monopolist doesn't, because they want to enjoy the profits that they could make. So price being greater than marginal cost means the monopolist produces less output than is socially desirable. In contrast, let's say we have the same demand curve and cost conditions. A firm in a perfectly competitive market would operate at the point where the price equals marginal cost. So they would operate at this point here, which means that the competitive industry output would happen here, QC, under perfect competition. And so therefore you have this amount of mutually beneficial transactions that could occur, but do not occur because the monopolist is taking advantage of their market power. Thus, the monopolist produces less output and charges a higher price than would a perfectly competitive industry. And thus, what results is a loss in consumer and producer surplus, which we call the deadweight loss. And it is represented by this triangle here, the difference between the demand curve and essentially the supply curve, times the amount of output that is not being produced. So this is just lost surplus that is a victim, essentially, of the monopolist. But again, the monopolist is benefiting from the situation. So that benefit does exist to society as a whole because they are part of society. But obviously, they also incur a cost to society, and that is a loss of excess willingness to pay by people that are willing to, that would be willing to pay more, that would be willing to buy more units of the output, but the monopolist is not willing to supply it. All right, finally, let's talk about monopolistic competition and tie up this section. So a market structure that lies between the extremes of monopoly and perfect competition is monopolistic competition. The market structure exhibits some characteristics present in both perfect competition and in monopoly. So let's talk about the conditions for monopolistic competition. The industry is monopolistically competitive if there are many buyers and sellers. So Unlike a monopoly, there are a lot of sellers. Much like a perfectly competitive market, there's many buyers and sellers. Each firm in the industry produces a differentiated product. So everybody produces something slightly different than what everybody else produces, versus a perfectly competitive market where everybody produces the exact same thing, and a monopoly in which there's only one thing being produced and nobody else is producing it. There is free entry and exit into these type of industries. So it's easy for firms to enter these industries and compete against existing firms in monopolistically competitive markets. Not the case at all for a monopolist, but also the case for perfect competition. So what this implies for monopolistic competition is that in the long run, there are not going to be any economic profits. If there are profits, that will lure other firms into the industry, and that will erode the profits. There are numerous industries in which firms produce products that are close substitutes, and the market for hamburgers is a prime example. So you have McDonald's, they make their Big Mac. You have Burger King, they make their Whopper. They're burgers. There's meat, there's bread, there's cheese, there's lettuce, tomato, onions, a burger. But McDonald's was able to say, well, mine's slightly different than everyone else's, and it's called the Big Mac. And Burger King was able to say the same thing and call theirs the Whopper. And because they're able to do that, then even though for us consumers, like, we do kind of see them as close substitutes, they're both kind of burgers, they are slightly different from each other, right? Like, we've been given the idea based on like advertising and things of that sort that they are different. And so even though we'll be willing to substitute between them, we won't be willing to substitute between them perfectly like we would in a perfectly competitive market. Everybody's selling the same exact thing. So for me, I might be loyal to the Big Mac, whereas you might be loyal to the Whopper. And therefore, I'm willing to pay more for the Big Mac, and you're willing to pay more for the Whopper. But if the price gets high enough for either one, we'll buy the other one because ultimately it's just a burger. So it's also relatively easy for new firms to enter and exit the market for burgers. So again, you get all sorts of different firms entering markets for burgers when there are profits being made. So over time, you do see more and more different types of burger places popping up all over the place because economic profits are being made. Those eventually get eroded. So the key difference with the model of perfect competition is that each firm produces a product that's slightly different from the other firm's products. The products are close but not perfect substitutes. The fact that the products are not perfect substitutes implies that each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve for its product, which looks more like the demand for a monopolist product. So because McDonald's is able to create their own market for their own version of the burger, the Big Mac, they essentially create their own little niche market, their own little sub-market for it, and therefore they have their own unique demand for that market, and therefore they face a downward sloping demand curve, just like a monopolist does. There's two important differences between a monopolistically competitive market and a market served by a monopolist, though. One, while a monopolistically competitive firm faces a downward sloping demand for its product, there are other firms in the industry that sell similar products. So there is competition there. And also, in a monopolistically competitive industry, there's no barriers to entry, which means that firms can enter and exit and erode profits. So this implies that firms will enter the market if existing firms earn economic profits. So the piece of the apple, as it were, of profits is going to be smaller, but they are definitely going to exist for a monopolistically competitive firm, potentially in the short run. As far as profit maximization goes, it works exactly the same as it does for a monopolist. So the determination of the profit maximizing price and output under monopolistic competition is precisely the same as for a firm operating under a monopoly, because again, they face that downward sloping demand curve, which means that once again, they're going to have their marginal revenue curve, which is going to be below the demand curve, and it's going to be twice as steep if we're talking about linear demand, which we're talking about linear demand in this class. And so therefore they're going to set their output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Then they're going to look at the demand curve to see how much people are willing to pay, and then the difference between what people are willing to pay and the average total cost represents the profit for the firm. So as far as all that goes, the pricing, the quantity, and the profits for a monopolist and a monopolistically competitive firm, it's the same as far as calculating it and figuring out and all that. So that gets us to the principle, the profit maximization rule for monopolistic competition. To maximize profits, a monopolistically competitive firm produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The profit maximizing price is the maximum price per unit that consumers are willing to pay for the profit maximizing level of output. So the price is the price at the optimal level at Q star. Since the firms in a monopolistically competitive industry produce differentiated products, slightly different versions of the same thing, the notion of an industry or market demand curve is not well defined. So when we looked at the rational consumer choice model in chapter 4, and we figured out what happens to people's optimal consumption bundles when prices change, we were able to map out individual people's demand for something. And then we were able to aggregate those demands by just doing a horizontal summation across prices, seeing how much each person is willing to demand of the product at a particular price, and then adding those together to get to the market demand. In a monopolistically competitive market, each firm produces a product that differs from other firms' products. So this demand by this person for this person's product, let's say it's the Big Mac, is different from the demand of this person for the Whopper. So you can't really add these together to get a total market demand for burgers in general because the products are slightly different. And so adding up these different products would be like adding up apples and oranges, and therefore you can't really pin down a market demand curve in a monopolistically competitive market. Quick demonstration problem just to work out the logistics of figuring out optimal quantities and prices. You'll see it's exactly like Monopoly, but we'll go through the example. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolistically competitive firm's product is given by 100 minus 2q, and the cost function is given by 5 plus 2q. Determine the profit maximizing price and quantity and the maximum profits. So again, what is their profit maximizing condition? Set what equal to what? Marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. What is marginal cost? 2. What is marginal revenue? What is the equation? 100 minus 4q, right? Just double the slope in absolute value. So using the marginal revenue formula for linear inverse demand and the formula for marginal cost, we see that marginal revenue equals 100 minus 4q, marginal cost equals 2. We set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost and do a little bit of algebra there, subtract 100 from both sides, divide both sides by 4, and we get 24.5. The profit maximizing price is found by setting Q equal to Q star in the inverse demand function. So again, you just put the quantity up to the inverse demand function to get the price. The price they charge is $51. So it's the same problem we did earlier because it's the same approach, but you have to understand it differently because you have to understand that it is a different market setting, monopolistically competitive versus monopoly. Profits are given by the difference between revenues and costs. So price times quantity minus the cost at the optimal amount. That's going to get us, again, that same profit amount. Long run equilibrium. So suppose a monopolistically competitive firm that sells brand X faces an initial demand curve, D naught. So this is their demand curve. This is the corresponding marginal revenue curve for that demand. Here's their marginal cost curve. That's going to determine their optimal quantity. We see that average total cost is below the price, so they're going to be earning positive economic profits. So because there's positive economic profits, that means that more firms will enter the industry. When more firms enter the industry, what happens to the demand curve in a market? Right, so what does that mean? The curve does what? It shifts to the right, right? Shifts up or to the right, very good. So as firms enter the market, so here's this firm. Again, that's the amount of output that they're going to supply. There's their price. This is the average total cost. So the difference between them is profit. So they're making profit. That lures more firms into the industry, which means that the demand for this firm's product is going to actually, in this case, because it's a monopolistically competitive market, and this demand curve basically represents like their niche market, as other firms enter and they sort of, create like a substitute for what they're selling, that means that the demand for this firm is going to decrease. So the demand for this firm is going to decrease. So the demand curve is going to shift to the right all the way to the point in the long run where the demand curve is just touching the average total cost curve, in which case there are zero economic profits. So in the long run, again, there will be zero economic profits for these type of firms, monopolistically competitive firms, as there were for perfectly competitive firms. So the long-run equilibrium in a monopolistically competitive industry means that each firm earns zero economic profits, but charges a price that exceeds the marginal cost of producing the goods. So in the long run, price equals average total cost, but price is greater than the marginal revenue. I'm sorry, yes, which is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and therefore price is greater than marginal cost, which is different from the long-run equilibrium for perfectly competitive firms where price equals marginal cost. And price also equals average total cost, much like in a perfectly competitive market, but the difference is that the average total cost is not the minimum of the average total cost. So in a perfectly competitive market, the firms in the long run operate at the point where there are zero economic profits, price equals marginal cost, and equals the minimum of average total cost. That is not the case with monopolistically competitive firms. So that means that firms do not take full advantage of economies of scale, meaning that they are not able to get big enough to be able to minimize the cost of producing because there's product variety. So there's too many firms in the industry to enable any individual firm to take full advantage of economies of scale in production. Some argue that this is simply the cost to society of having product variety. So in order to have more product variety, we have to accept the fact that things are going to cost more to produce, which means that things are going to cost more for us to buy. And so that's sort of what we're indirectly kind of okay with. Like, we're not all complaining about it. We're not all like, hey, I just want one type of burger. I'm willing to pay, I'm going to pay less for it. I want to pay less for it. And I'm willing to give up this variety. Like, we're not clamoring for that, right? We're not like protesting out in the streets like we are for like Donald Trump. Like, we're just okay with the fact that, there's a lot of different types of burgers that can satiate our different tastes at different times. And it means that we have to pay a little bit more for it, but we don't really notice it ultimately. Implications of product differentiation. The demand for a firm's product is less elastic when consumers view other firms' products as poor substitutes for it. Therefore, as a firm manager in a monopolistically competitive firm, you're going to have less elastic demand than you would in a perfectly competitive market. The less elastic demand for the firm's product, the greater the potential for earning profits. Thus, many firms in monopolistically competitive industries continually attempt to convince consumers that their products are better than those offered by other firms, and they do so with advertising. So firms in monopolistically competitive industries employ two strategies to persuade consumers that their products are better than those offered by competitors. First, they spend considerable amount on advertising campaigns. Usually, they embark on what's called comparative advertising, which is designed to differentiate a given firm's brand from brands sold by competing firms, right? It's really the commercials that really make us think that a Big Mac is different from a Whopper. Really, ultimately, they taste very similar. And what this comparative advertising does is it creates brand equity. It's the additional value that a brand adds to the product. Secondly, firms in monopolistically competitive industries frequently introduce new products into the market to further differentiate their products from other firms. These include not only new improved products, as well as completely different product lines. Monopolistically competitive firms may also attempt to create and advertise new products that fill special needs in the market, like they employ what's called niche marketing, which involves products or services targeted to a specific group of consumers. Sometimes they'll use what's called green marketing. It's an example of niche marketing in which firms create and advertise environmentally friendly products in an attempt to capture the segment of the market that's concerned with environmental issues. Unfortunately, successful differentiation and branding strategies sometimes make managers myopic, meaning that they can't see the forest for the trees. They sometimes get caught up in their approach to what they're doing in the market based on what they've come to know, and they don't really see that there might be changing conditions that require new products, new versions, like when our society started to become a little bit more environmentally conscious, and we started to ask for environmentally friendly products. Firms that didn't see this coming, were competed out of these markets. So you might be a brand myopic manager who is satisfied with an existing brand, is slow to launch new products, and is not aware of emerging industry trends or changes in consumer preferences. It's a pitfall that you want to avoid. All right, folks, that is the end of this section. That's the end of this chapter, and that is the end of the second part of the course. So good job, everybody. All right, let's take a break. Let's come back at 8:35, and we will continue with the next part of the course.